Sexuality and gender. Let's start off with some basic terms and concepts so we're all starting from the same page. How about sex versus gender? Sex, in the way that we're going to talk about it today, probably isn't what you're thinking. When I'm talking about sex, I'm talking about our parts. What are the physiological structures that make us who we are? Sex is about chromosomes, it's about what you got in your pants. Sex is about the way you're shaped. It's about the internal parts of your body, your hormones. Gender is about the way that you see yourself, the way that you move through the world and experience the world. Gender is also about the ways that the world expects you to behave. Sexual behavior versus sexual orientation. Now, we talk a lot about sexual orientation, but I like to make a distinction between sexual orientation and sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is about who do you desire? Whose bodies do you desire? It's also about whose bodies do you choose to share yourself with. Sexual behavior is the bow chicka wow wow stuff. Sexual orientation, it's about who you fall in love with. Sexual orientation is about who do you gravitate towards for comfort and care? Who would you want to build a home with? Who might you choose to build a family with? Who do you fall in love with? Human beings are very black and white thinkers. It's either yes or it's no. It's male or it's female. It's chocolate or vanilla. That's the way our brains work. We have to have a way to organize things, especially really complex things. In terms of sex, we break the world down between male and female. In terms of gender, we break the world down between masculine and feminine. In terms of sexual orientation, as well as sexual behavior, we break the world down between an opposite sex and gender orientation and a same-sex and gender orientation. We expect that somebody who's declared male at birth, based on the parts that we see, is going to move through the world in masculine ways and act and behave in ways that are culturally expected of someone who's male, behave masculine. We also expect that that same person is going to be sexually attracted to, behaviorally, to people of the opposite sex and gender, to women. While everything we've talked about so far, I think we can all pretty much say this is true, it's only half of the truth. Sexuality and gender is really pretty complicated. We've talked about the binary. What we need to talk about now is what's the stuff between the binary, between the polar opposites. There's a whole spectrum of the experience and the expectations around sexuality and gender. Not only is there male and female in terms of our physiological structures, but there are also persons whose physiological structures are not clearly male or female, persons who are intersex. It may mean that their genitalia are kind of ambiguous. It may mean that their chromosomes or their hormonal compositions aren't easily identifiable as either male or female. In terms of gender, we see another broad array of behaviors that fall between the extremes of masculinity and femininity. There are some people in your life, I'm sure who you know, who are more androgynous, that they're not as feminine as some people or not as masculine as others. In terms of their appearance, the way they move through the world, the way they talk, their interests, their activities. In terms of sexual orientation and sexual behavior, there are people who fall in the middle of the binary who may be bisexual or pansexual or queer or just sexual. That they're attracted to others based on things that may not be strictly related to their sex and gender, the sex and gender of others. So let's talk through a couple of examples. So someone who's born male in terms of their physiological body and composition may move through the world and experience the world in a way that's very feminine. So their sex and their gender aren't necessarily consistent. Sometimes we refer to someone in this circumstance as being transgender. I like to think of transgender as meaning transcending gender, transcending, stepping outside of those gender binary boxes that are culturally constructed that we're expected to be in. Persons who are transgender, essentially the most basic description is that their sex and their gender don't necessarily match up in the ways that we've been culturally trained to expect them to. In terms of sexual orientation and sexual behavior, there may be a female person who's primarily attracted to men but at the same time tends to fall in love and have their most significant relationships with women that are also sexual. For this spectrum of sexuality and gender, people can fall all over the board across that spectrum, and sometimes where they fall on the spectrum of sex, gender, orientation, and behavior can change over time. Sexuality and gender is extremely complicated. And just because we don't always understand the hows, the whys, or the whats of it, doesn't mean it's not somebody else's reality. In this model of sexuality and gender, there's one more really, really important piece that I like to talk about last, and that's identity. Identity is about language. Language is extremely powerful. Identity is about the words we choose to label ourselves with, and it's also about the words that others choose to label us, often, always, based on the assumptions that they make about us. Identity is the language of self. The terms that people use fall all over the place. There's bisexual, gay, lesbian, heterosexual, straight, there's queer, questioning, intersex, there's transgender, there's tranny queer, tranny boy, there's boy girl, there's butch girl, there's femme girl, there's lipstick dyke and lesbian, and all kinds of different words that people choose to label themselves. You are the only one that knows the realities of where you fall across the spectrum of sexuality and gender. The main reason why we're doing this training today is to inspire you to think of yourself as an other. You are always making assumptions about everyone who's around you, and they're always making assumptions about you as well. Think about, very carefully, the spectrum and the complexity of sexuality and gender. And know that what you see on the outside of someone, the way you interpret someone, may not be the way that they work internally and what's happening in their lives. Unless you create an environment, a safe space, for people to be truly authentic and fully human with you, you might miss out on some really important pieces of the people who are in your life.